All right, we're not taking a break between that and the next panel. We're going to go right into it, right? That's what we're going to do. All right, I want to invite, we want to have a discussion now with Moira Mcdonald from the Walton Family Foundation, the Nature Conservancy, Sean McMahon, and Rod Snyder of Field to Market. We're going to talk about sustainability. So if I can ask those folks to come up, please. And you're all mic'd up?
Yes, sir.
Go. Good to see you. Whichever one you want.
Feelings about where we sit.
And there's Rod. Okay, we were going to talk about sustainability on this panel, but in fact, I think we should just talk about GMO for the next little while. It seems to get you guys going a little more. It's what we call a hot button issue in the news. This is an interesting topic for me. I was one of those people who truly, I think I love the idea of sustainability, but if anybody ever started a discussion with me about it, I would just sort of glaze over and pretend I needed to be somewhere else. And some time ago, I decided that this is just dumb. Like, I can't just say that I like something and then really not get it beyond a retail application, right? We all try and do what we can do to be in a more sustainable environment. So I started to get more involved formally in a role like this, where I would attend conferences, I would moderate panels, I'd learn from people, I'd surround myself with experts at very high levels who understand this as a concept and understand it as a game changer and as a economic model, how we really achieve sustainability. So we wanted to ask we've been going out and getting those videos, and we wanted to ask people how they sort of relate to sustainability. Let's roll the video. I don't think any of them are wrong. I think those are all the things, and I think that's part of what makes the conversation complicated and difficult, is that it's a lot of things, and all of those things are there. But obviously, if you want to start implementing it and making it part of the system, I think you have to fine-tune it a little bit. So Rod, let's start with you. Let's fine-tune this conversation about sustainability. What does it mostly mean to you?
Yeah, I actually thought the folks did a pretty decent job for person on the street interviews. But Field to Market essentially defines sustainability as being able to meet current needs while improving the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. So it really is kind of having that eye to the future, clearly understanding how we're meeting needs today, but positioning us in a way that we can do better moving forward. So it is long range thinking, like several people said.
Sean, let's talk to you next about what you feel that it is. Obviously, the Nature Conservancy is very involved in this, and you spend a lot of time thinking about it. What do you add to this?
Yeah, well, I definitely agree with Rod. Ever since the Brundtland Commission back in the 1980s defined sustainable development in the terms that Rod has described, that's how most of the conservation community, at least, has come to view it. So in the context of agriculture, what does that mean? Meeting the needs of the current generation without compromising future generations' ability to meet their needs. And I think of farming, and I think of what's sustainable. Will this farm be able to exist, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 centuries from now? What are the rates of soil depletion? If we're talking about an irrigated landscape, what's the rates of irrigation versus aquifer recharge or depletion? Will there be the resources necessary to farm into the future? So, we at the Nature Conservancy also do take a triple bottom line approach to sustainability, where we think about not just the environmental components, but the economic and social as well. I love how we had a 6th-generation rancher up here on the stage earlier. Clearly, your family was sustainable. If you're on that same operation today, then you are using your resources wisely, and your ancestors were clearly doing their job in a way that was economically profitable and economically sustainable to let you do that. So, we think that triple bottom line is very important. For the Nature Conservancy, we're mostly focused on the environmental part of that stool.
Moira?
You stole my answer.
Oh, sure.
Very good.
So at the Walton
Look, I don't mind if you all agree with each other, because the last panel sort of did, but at least the panel didn't agree with them. So can we just have some kind of, just find some place where we can fight?
So at the Walton Family Foundation, we also take a triple bottom line approach to it, and we try to look at practices that can advance agronomic and environmental outcomes at the same time. So we try to look at sustaining farmer incomes and improving environmental outcomes. And we look at the social piece too. We're not as good at we don't focus our grant making on that, and we haven't gotten as good at evaluating our outcomes in terms of that, but we do try to pay attention to what that ends up meaning.
So you are not Walmart. You are the foundation. You have something to do with Walmart.
They have a Walmart Foundation too.
Right. So
Yeah.
you talk. You know who to call there, but basically it's not them. So you fund things, and how if sustainability is your paradigm, what do you fund and how do you decide?
So I work in the environment program, and I work on issues on the Mississippi River, and we work on the whole thing, stem to stern. In the upper river, we focus on agriculture, and we look at how can we improve the environmental outcomes of agriculture, and the big focus for us is reducing excess nutrient runoff, mostly from fertilizer. And so we look at practices that help minimize that while maintaining or improving farmer incomes. We look at efficiency, but we also look at practices that can, over time, improve the health of the resource. So we look at in this case, soil mostly, but also water. So we look at improving soil health and various ways in which you can go about, maintaining and improving, keeping more of your soil and improving its health. And then we also look at, ultimately all these things are to benefit water quality.
And Rod, you are one of the people who's benefited from some of that funding. What do you do?
So Field to Market essentially is a multi-stakeholder organization that brings together, we were talking earlier about how do you get folks from different corners of the room to come to a place where we're willing to sit down and have a conversation. That's what Field to Market really was all about. It's been around about 7 years now. And you had, environmental and conservation NGOs, agribusiness, farm organizations, everybody sitting down and saying, we need to figure out some common metrics about how we measure and define sustainability for commodity crops in the U.S. And so that really hard scientific work has been done over the last 5 or 6, 7 years to reach a consensus around how we measure and talk about these things. That was no small task to get to that place. And so, now we have an online calculator that helps farmers be able to assess their own performance and measure their own outcomes. All of it is outcomes based, which, if you want to talk about some differences in the sustainability space, some would say that the better approach is just to have a checklist of, do this, but don't do this, use these technologies, don't use these. The approach that Field to Market has taken is that, we want to understand the environmental outcomes of whatever choices a farmer is making, recognizing that all over the country, the United States is huge. You have lots of different growing regions and soil types and climates. Farmers need to be able to make innovation decisions on, sort of on their own, but in an informed way, and really be able to take a science-based look at what are those environmental outcomes. So Field to Market has really helped to define that and given farmers a tool to do that analysis.
So I would actually think that the checklist would be really convenient because
Be easier.
It could be easier. What are the outcomes that you're measuring? Give us some examples.
Right. So greenhouse gas emissions, energy use, water quality, water use, soil erosion, soil carbon, soil quality, things of that nature. There's about 7 different metrics. Again, there's a broader conversation that can be had around social and economic pieces as well. So far, Field to Market's work has mostly been on the environmental side.
All right, as has yours, Sean. But what's the work that you're doing as related to this?
Well, one answer I didn't hear from Rod and Mara that I'll focus on is sustainability within agriculture as it relates to land use and biodiversity. At the Nature Conservancy, we pay a lot of attention to those issues. We've been around for 60 years, and over those 6 decades, through a number of partnerships, we've helped protect an area about the size of California, 120 million acres. Now, the UN Food and Agriculture Organization predicts that in the next 3.5 decades, we're going to lose 2.5 Californias of natural areas that are going to be converted to cropland. And those will mostly be tropical forests and temperate grasslands. So at the Nature Conservancy, we, like many other organizations, including many in the room, we have a strategy of sustainable intensification of agriculture that's really focused on how can we increase yields on our current cropland and also on our current rangeland and pasture land. But how can we boost that production on our current ag acres, intensification, so we don't need to see as much extensification as far as natural areas that are converted to cropland. But as Mara and Rod said, we also care very much about water quality, soil conservation, a number of conservation outcomes that really differ depending on which growing region we're talking about.
So Mara, how do you differentiate, because these are all good goals, but they're not really counter to things that everybody in the industry would like to happen, generally speaking, right? Generally speaking, we'd like to increase yields, we'd like to sustain farms, we'd like to preserve water resources, use them as most effectively. In the last panel, what we realized is that the industry is actually really good at funding stuff that is beneficial to the industry and to production. Why is this not all covered by the industry? What is it? What vacuum? What market failure are you addressing?
If you're focused on the issue of water quality, of the water that comes off agricultural lands, water that runs off agricultural lands is not regulated through the Clean Water Act in any way, and so we have, over time, developed a problem with having an excess of nitrogen and phosphorus in the water that comes off agricultural lands. And so we go after looking at that, and I think people consider it sort of an externality. Like, yes, farmers want to be good stewards. Yes, farmers want to be good community members and contributors, but they don't have a system where they get feedback on their environmental performance in relation to water quality, because there's no meter at the end of their farm looking at how that works, and they're not regulated. So it does sort of fall back on the community to figure out how do we incentivize improved performance in this regard.
And go ahead, Rod.
No.
So you have these measures that you've established, and give us a sense of the rollout. How extensive is it? How do you convince people to use them? And I guess part of the issue, here's where I see something interesting. Sean was talking about keeping a farm going for 500 years, and you were talking about Megan's farm that, for 6 generations, and how sustainable that is. You're talking about immediate outcomes. You're talking about measuring things this year and next year with the hope that if you measure it, you do all those things and you measure it properly, then the farm's going to be around for 500 years?
Well, that's correct. I mean, no single year's measurement is going to tell an entire story. I mean, if you look at the drought of 2012, folks had a really tough year, both with probably environmental outcomes and productivity. So you have to look over, you do need to measure over time, which is part of Field to Market's goal, is to sort of make this, part of the way that farmers are operating on a day-to-day basis, that they're considering these things. Right now, we've got about a dozen or 15 pilot projects in different places using different crops around the country that are using the tool over multi-year assessments, so they can kind of see how they're doing over time. Normally, this is in partnership with other companies and organizations like the Nature Conservancy, but also on the private sector side, Cargill or Bunge, as well as food companies like Kellogg's or Coca-Cola, that have a real interest in their supply chains and how they're sourcing agricultural goods. That's really, I think, sort of the driver and the linchpin behind a lot of this work, is that all this conversation we've been having all day about consumer perceptions and people wanting to know where their food comes from. These food companies are taking a real interest in this because of that. And so they are partnering with farmers at the farm, at the field level, to do these types of measurements and to have an informed conversation about what we call continuous improvement. So year over year, how can farmers make decisions that drive better outcomes over time? And that's really getting the whole food and ag supply chain working together in a way that has never happened before. I think that's why it's very exciting.
And does that end up being the goal? Because I know you and I talked about it more about supply chain.
Yeah, we see, when we look at, so having too much N&P in the river is a problem because you get a dead zone in the Gulf, and because a lot of people drink the water from the Mississippi, and having too much nitrogen and phosphorus there creates water quality problems in freshwater. So how can you change that? We see 3 drivers. Supply chain is one of them. Regulatory stuff would be another. We actually don't work on that. And then the third is farm policy. It's through the Farm Bill. How does crop insurance and the other support programs for farmers, what does that incentivize for them? So those are the three drivers that we look at when we think about how to change this.
Sean, an environmental NGO has got to have some points of conflict here when you get all these parties together. Where have you found that you've had to get over things or work with things or agree with other parties that, you know what, we don't necessarily see the same side of this, but we're working toward a similar end?
Yeah, well, it may be counterintuitive, Ollie, but the way the Nature Conservancy approaches this issue, we're a science-based organization, and so we look at what are those different outcomes that we measure through things like field to market, and how can we put into effect strategies like what Moira just talked about, be it Farm Bill, supply chain engagements to help realize those outcomes. And I'm thinking about the last panel and some of the tensions that were expressed in terms of what does biotech and what do GMOs mean? And I wanted to put that in a context for the room in terms of some conservation outcomes. Like soil conservation is very important to the Nature Conservancy. Moira was talking about the problem with water quality with phosphorus. Well, phosphorus bonds with soil. So if you have soil eroding off a field, you're going to be putting phosphorus in local waterways, and that can cause algal blooms, eutrophication. So between 1980 and 2011, thanks in part to crop protection products, like glyphosate, other herbicides, and also genetic engineering, we've seen marked improvements. For corn, there's 44% less soil erosion between 1980 and 2010. For soybeans, it's 66%, and for corn, for cotton, it's 68%. So really quite substantial. Because of herbicides, we save 356 billion pounds a year in soil. So that's good for farmers for maintaining their soil. It's good for the general public because it means cleaner water. I did the math, and one interesting visual here is if you take all that soil and you put it into coal trains, 110-ton coal cars, you could have 8 trains going from Washington, D.C. to Los Angeles, and another train going from Washington, D.C. to St. Louis. So that's how much soil we're saving because of herbicides. So, I just offer that as an example that there's, perhaps less conflict than you might think between some conservation organizations and the ag sector.
I see, and you're a science-based organization, so I understand how you come to that, but you did mention your support of genetic engineering of crops in there. Does that put you at odds with others in your world?
I should say about that those are, the Nature Conservancy doesn't have an official position on genetic engineering. But I look at the situation, I think, this challenge we face, how do we feed the world by 2050, is really the greatest challenge, facing humanity for this generation and the next several. And I think to tie one or two hands behind our backs really just does a disservice, to everyone. And I think that would unfortunately result in hundreds of millions of children starving around the world, and also hundreds of millions of acres of additional natural areas being converted to cropland.
Rod, let's go back to you about some of the successes. I'm just trying to understand the model. You are information gathering now, you're piloting, you're testing the system out, and you're actually having these pilots or these farms that are using the metrics make adjustments on a year-to-year basis?
That's right, yeah. So in some of the early examples that we've seen so far, for example, wheat growers in Idaho over the past few years have noticed that with irrigation water that they've been using, they've actually been able to sort of tweak their water use a little bit and use less because they were really doing that comparative analysis of how their water use was comparing to their neighbors. It's all anonymized, but in the project, as well as against sort of state averages, et cetera. So having real data, real-time data, to make decisions has allowed them to actually use less water, which also saves them money, by the way. So oftentimes these things are not at odds. If you can save money and save water at the same time, everyone's winning in that scenario. Right. So there are lots of examples in this sustainability conversation where if we bring examples like that forward, it's not as scary of a conversation for farmers. You're actually talking about economic profitability as well.
And Moira, you use that triple bottom line model as well. Is it difficult to, I mean, obviously you find projects like this and you're able to fund them, and that's great because they're people who are doing a lot of good work. Is it difficult to draw this connection for everybody, or is this is not hard work? In other words, do people recognize the value of?
I think that increasingly people do. On the fertilizer piece, figuring out how to get your application just right so you use less, people see that in the same year. They see an improvement. We've seen over the past.
Well, we heard this morning from Dee Dee the selective application of fertilizer and herbicides and pesticides, that they go out there, they don't use more than they need, but it helps them where they use it.
Soil testing
and
and
they're
stuff, yeah.
able to have that conversation with their customers to explain to them that we don't have it's not an either or, it's a.
Yeah, both hand.
Yeah.
Over the past 5 years, we've seen a ton of growth in the area of cover crops. And this is sort of a back to the future practice. It's something we used to use a lot before we had herbicides, but people are finding that it's not that expensive, and we can see improvements in soil organic matter, which leads to improvements in yield, and it doesn't take that many years. It takes some time to figure out exactly how to do it, and it does make our lives a little more complicated, but a lot of farmers, even a lot of very traditional corn and soybean farmers, are finding it really positive and fairly quickly. So we found actually a lot of these applications. I don't think that everything works that way, but we found that it's been pretty productive.
I think the Back to the Future idea is interesting because on one hand, we've had a very hearty discussion in here about technology and what it's done for agriculture and the conflicts there. And on the other hand, this is not the only example of older technology that we're moving to. What are some
older
other
practices?
Older practices.
I mean, we've seen some data start to come out of Iowa State recently about crop rotation, and putting a third or fourth year into the rotation can reduce your inputs. It's a little more labor, but it's another way to have potentially improved environmental outcomes. That's at a small scale. We have to look at that at a bigger scale. But yeah, I think there are a lot of practices that people used before that we're starting to look at. This doesn't mean we're not going to use glyphosate or we're not going to have herbicides, but it means that we're looking at other ways to manage these systems in a way that can have better environmental outcomes.
Sean, you've sort of reversed engineered your way into the support of this, because I want to go back to the beginning. Your goal really as the Nature Conservancy is to preserve that land that is not otherwise being used for this. So you might actually be able to bend some of your principles a little bit if you can keep the farming going. In other words, if you can intensify farming on existing land, that's
a good outcome.
Getting where you need to go.
And if we can do it sustainably, where we're maintaining or enhancing water quality, water availability, biodiversity, so much the better.
Rod, where do you see what you're doing going? By the way, I just want to invite those of you out there to tweet or go to the mics. And if you're not motivated to do so, I'll get these guys to say something insulting. Rod, where does this go? Does this become large scale? Is this scalable? Is there what's your vision for how this, because it sounds fascinating to me. How do you unpack this? And because it sounds to me like I'd have no good reason, if I were a farmer, not to want to get involved in this.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think it's scalable. There are tricky conversations around data usage and privacy. I mean, we're moving into an era of big data in agriculture, just like many other industries, quite frankly. That can be a little intimidating at times to folks. Where does this data end up? Who owns it? Who's managing it? People want their privacy protected, right? So that conversation is an important one. And Field to Market feels like it needs to have policies in place that reassures folks around that. So scalability, you have to have that conversation about data. You also have to have a conversation about technology. Folks right now farmers are using GPS, as we discussed earlier today, other really technologically advanced farm management programs that help them make decisions on their farm. Field to Market wants to connect up with all these different platforms and tools so that it's really happening in an integrated way, so that you're not just...
And how does that work? Is there a common language? Is there an infrastructure that allows that all to happen?
Yeah, now we're really getting in the weeds here, but yeah, that's all being developed within agriculture right now so that different systems can talk to one another. But once that's in place, and it's really going to happen this year, quite frankly, it really enables a lot of this to happen quite quickly. So we're trying to position ourselves in a way that we can really be that common platform in a pre-competitive way. And it's important that I say that because companies we actually have competing companies, that are members of Field to Market. But when it comes to conversations around sustainability metrics, we want everyone talking off the same sheet of music.
So what's the danger that somebody goes and develops a system that doesn't speak the same language, it doesn't integrate, and wants to sell it to, what you probably don't want is 5 different systems going
Well,
on.
farmers don't want that because they have limited time. I mean, most farms are not huge corporations that have lots. I mean, contrary to a lot of folks' opinions, they don't have tons of employees to be able to answer 15 different sustainability surveys. So if you can get companies agreeing on a common platform, you can get that technology integration, and farmers only have to do this once, then it's much less intimidating. So that's where we reach scale. You're going to start to see, I think, increasing interest in companies asking for this at the grain elevator, for instance. We want to make sure that this is as easy for farmers as possible.
Moira, you did a nice job picking that project. What else is out there like that? I mean, this is easy for even a guy like me to understand.
The supply chain stuff?
Yeah.
So Field to Market's the sort of biggest game in town. They've worked on this for 7 years, and they really have all the players at the table. So it's pretty exciting. Sean and I are working together on another partnership with the corn growers, where they're working on demonstrating the co-benefits of nutrient management, better nutrient management, cover crops, no-till, and other practices. But it doesn't have at this point, it doesn't have the same supply chain link. We think it might down the road, because we think there's opportunities to integrate it into the supply chain that farmers see, into their input supply chain.
Their input supply chain, okay.
So that's the kind of thing that we're thinking about as we flesh this out.
And again, Sean, how do you pick where you get involved as the Nature Conservancy?
That's an interesting question. So we have a history of where we've operated,
Yeah.
where we've used the best available science to pick, okay, what are the hot spots of biodiversity around the world? And that's generally where we've had our project areas. For our ag strategy, we look at, okay, which ones of those places with the very best biodiversity, the highest conservation values, which ones of those are in ag watersheds or ag landscapes? And then we look at, okay, what are the priority resource concerns that we need to address? And that informs how we go about our projects. So, in the cases of row crops, in particular corn and soybeans, we really focus on soil health and nutrient stewardship. And to get back to that triple bottom line perspective, the neat thing about that framing is that by adopting practices that improve soil health and also have more efficient utilization of nutrients, farmers are able to increase their yields, improve their profitability, and increase their environmental performance simultaneously. So it's really a great win-win-win.
Excellent. Ted.
Yes, thank you. Microphone on? Maybe it is now. There we are. Ali, this question isn't for you, but I know it's going to perk your attention. Water sustainability. The report just came out last week that 50% of the arable land in the United States is in drought. The aquifers that most of the corn, soybeans, and wheat are produced with are dropping. What are your organizations doing about specifically water sustainability? How can we help farmers deal with that to reduce their dependency on water? This isn't just an American issue, it's a worldwide issue.
Well, I'll take the first crack at that. So globally, 70% of the water that's used by humans goes to agriculture. So this is a huge problem that you've pointed out. And if you look around the world, there's aquifer depletion that's going on. So producers are using water at rates that aren't sustainable. Those aquifers are not being recharged as quickly as they're being depleted. So we're partnering with farmers and helping them increase their irrigation efficiency. Where they're doing flood irrigation, we're helping them put in center pivots. Where they have old center pivot technology, we're helping them get newer technology. There's something called VRI, variable rates of irrigation, where that iron, that center pivot, can spin around at different speeds, and the different nozzles on the pivot have different rates of how water's applied. And then you can use soil moisture monitors so that instead of the old way of watering for the driest spot in the field, you're actually putting about exactly as much water as needed for every spot of the field. So we're partnering with different companies on that technology. But for the Nature Conservancy, one thing that's very important for us is environmental flows. You know, if producers are able to be more efficient in their water use, some producers then would put more land into production and use the water there. And then as you're boosting yields, you actually increase the rates of evapotranspiration. So that could be drawing down the water that's flowing in streams. So we like to get a win-win out of these situations, helping farmers to improve their irrigation practices, but at the same time, maintaining those critical flows that are needed for aquatic biodiversity.
Rod, water was a few of your metrics.
Absolutely,
you mentioned.
yeah. I think there's sort of two pieces here. One is if you're not actively measuring, you obviously can't do much about the outcome, right? So really setting those benchmarks first and getting farmers to understand where they're currently operating. The second piece is maybe a tougher conversation, but it's one that Field to Market is having as well, which is what are our longer term goals as an agricultural sector with all of those multi-stakeholder organizations sitting around the table around, looking out 5, 10, 20 years or more. How are we going to have to be performing when it comes to water use to ensure that we don't have aquifer depletion? That's a secondary conversation that you can only have once you're really actively measuring, and then you can try to set some goals and drive towards them, and you can try to establish practices and technologies to get there. I think Field to Market is positioned in a way to have that conversation as well, because you still have all those same players.
Do we know? I mean, that's an interesting point. This is the first time we sort of talked about this in terms of vision, right? We have statistics about urbanization. We have statistics about drought. We have statistics about farmland, number of farms, increasing yield. We have all of that, but what is the vision? When you talk to all these stakeholders, what is our vision as an agriculture society?
That gets back to probably the most basic question at the beginning, which is
what is sustainability?
What is sustainability?
Right, but we do know, for instance, we know that we can adjust the number of farms. We can adjust the number of farm workers. We know we can create different crops and adjust them properly, and we can manage our water. But what are we going to be?
Well, I mean, I hate to beat a dead horse, but it really is kind of the driver in all this conversation, and we have to produce. I think I've heard it said a couple different ways, but 70% more food between now and 2050 than we ever have. I think it's more food in the next 40 years than we have in 10,000. I mean, those numbers are staggering,
right.
And so it really does take everyone's participation and a common vision to get there. Farmers, I believe, are doing everything they can currently, using technology to try to do their own little part. But how do we all come together around that conversation, around technology development, around innovative practices? I mean, and we've talked a lot about GMOs today. Field to Market is also sort of agnostic on that question as well.
I was going to ask you, your systems that you're building are meant to measure.
It's outcomes based. You can be an organic producer. You can use GMOs. It doesn't really matter. We want to understand the environmental outcome.
So that means the outcome is the baseline is what somebody's already doing.
Correct.
Because
right.
you can't compare those two. If it's outcomes based and it needs to be a particular level, those two will be different.
Right. That's right. And so how can, no matter what practice you're using, how can you do better over time? But what I was going to point out was there are companies that are actively developing drought resistant seed technology, which could allow less water to be used potentially on certain crops. That may not only be applicable in the U.S., but also think about places in Africa and elsewhere where you have water shortage that's serious. Can you actually get people to be able to feed themselves in places of the world? That could be an exciting technology development in the next 5 years or so. Field to Market, again, we don't have any policy on that, but we want to be able to measure that and understand what the impact of that would be.
Do you guys have a policy on GMO or a position?
GMO, we too are agnostic.
Lord.
I know, we're no fun, huh?
If you did have a policy, what would it be? Actually, I'm pushing it for one reason. Although, Mark, do you have a question?
Quick one. All the statistics about 9 billion produce 70% more food assume roughly equivalent diet in the future, and people coming out of the middle class in India and China eating a meat-based diet. Are any of you working on the issue of either changing diets or reducing food waste as opposed to just produce?
I'm working on changing my diet. It's not very successful. But I don't think that was his question. Does that come into your worlds at all?
It's not the focus of field to market.
You're on the production side.
Right, we are on the production side, and I think for purposes of getting that right, I think that's where we need to have our attention. There are lots of other
Because
groups.
you can adapt. It doesn't really matter. If the diets change, you can, your
Absolutely.
system is a measurement system.
That's correct, yeah.
Moira, you look like you were answering that.
Oh, we don't work on it. We fund Agree, which is a collection of, it's a sort of ag policy think tank that was formed by 9 foundations, and that's one of their key issues. So I sort of play at it, but we don't fund anything in that regard.
And what are they aiming to do? To think about better returns
They're
on what you
looking
eat?
at like post-harvest loss and those kinds of issues to look at, long-term, how do we find ways to both intensify sustainably and, there's other leakage in the system that can be used to feed 9 billion.
So Sean, this strikes me as being right up your alley. If you could actually lower the net requirement for food, that would lower the net requirement for the land you're trying to protect.
I mean, I'm not volunteering to stop eating, by the way, and just want to put that out there.
But I think, Mark, you're talking about the portfolio of food, whether or not this is a grand thing that we've decided that the world needs more protein and fat.
And the Nature Conservancy has a vegan diet, partly for environmental reasons.
And if you take a good look at me, you can see that I don't.
So yeah, out of my mouth. That I meant about me, not about you.
Yeah, so we don't work on food waste, and we don't have any programs about diets. We recognize that food waste is a really important issue. About 30% of our food is wasted, whether or not you're in the developed world, where it's really, wasted post-consumer, either in our refrigerators or at restaurants or events like today, or the developing world, where it really perishes, after harvest and before it gets to the consumer. But at the Nature Conservancy, we stick to our areas of expertise, which is more about conservation and conservation outcomes. So that's not a strategy we're engaged in, but we do recognize it's important.
Rod, a lot of the work you do, the reason that I'm so fascinated by it is because one of the areas, I'm a business reporter, I like measurement of all sorts, but the other side of it is that you have stakeholders who have very, very different interests. I mean, I guess at one point there's a common interest, right? Let's produce more effectively with fewer resources used at a lower cost and get a better return. But ultimately they have different interests, and we certainly in the last panel saw struggles with that in this industry. Where are the points of tension where you're getting these different stakeholders together, and how do you overcome them?
Yeah, I mean, there's lots of tough conversations that we have to have. For instance, even just through the metrics development phase, if a farmer adopts a certain conservation practice, what's the actual impact of that? Some would suggest it's larger than others. When you look at the science, you look at sort of the literature that's available. Those are really geeky conversations.
Give me a for instance, though.
Fertilizer use, and I mean, let's say a conversation we're having right now around fertilizer efficiency, like a nitrous inhibitor fertilizer technology. What's the overall impact of that? The literature is in a couple different places. So we have a pretty technical conversation around how much credit does a farmer get when we give them their score for using that particular type of technology, right? So, I mean, those are really boring conversations, but they all have an impact in what the outcome is that the farmer is getting back when they get their score at the end, right? So those are types of conversations that are tricky. You also have tough conversations on the consumer-facing side around what kinds of claims can a company like, let's take General Mills and Kellogg's, since they're both in the cereal business. What kind of claims can they make based on this data that we're getting back? Can you put a sustainability logo on a box of cereal or not? How closely do you have to know kind of where you're sourcing from, and what percentage of that grain has to come through our system for a company to make a sustainability claim? Those are really tricky conversations, and some of them are policy decisions, others are science decisions, which I was referencing a moment ago. But I don't think there's anybody else positioned quite like we are that has that representation to even begin that conversation.
Because as you could see, again, from the last panel, we had that discussion that the minute the corporations are involved and there's a verification or a labeling or a claim that can be made, there are going to be some people who are going to say, well, hold on, how did that get
Right, how did you get to that? Right.
How'd you get to that?
Yeah.
And there is, so you don't probably intersect with the public trust issue just yet, right? It's too early?
I mean, Yeah, that's correct. I mean, anybody could take a look at our membership and they could see groups that they like, groups that they don't like, depending upon what side you're on. But we could be called into question just because of somebody who's a member of Field to Market. I mean, that's true of any multi-stakeholder organization like Field to Market.
So you just have to make sure that there's lots of people from different places.
Yeah. That's the best. I think that's the best you can do.
I mean, you must lend your credibility to this effort. Generally, this idea of sustainability on farms.
I would hope so, and there are other NGOs that are part of Field to Market as well. But to answer your question about what points of tension, thanks to Field to Market, we have some excellent data sets on the tremendous continuous improvement that's gone on in U.S. agriculture for many different row crops over the last 3 decades. I think one point of tension is that there are some ag associations that see that progress, and they're tempted to declare we're sustainable. Look at our continuous improvement. But there's a flaw in that the continuous improvement data represents aggregated national data, but it doesn't tie into important conservation outcomes, at the growing region or watershed scale. So that continuous improvement, particularly when it's measured in terms of intensity, those different environmental outcomes per bushel of output, that can mask what's also continuous degradation. So I really think that in order to declare sustainability, and spike the football in the end zone, we've got to link what's happening at the farm scale and link that nationally aggregated data to things like trends of Gulf hypoxia, algal blooms in Western Lake Erie Basin, Chesapeake Bay water quality, depletion of the Ogallala Aquifer, and things like that. So that is a bit of a point of tension in part between ag interests and conservation interests.
Where are we on the continuum, on the goal of being able to both produce the amount of food we have to produce, as an example you gave, Rod, that's been stated, or your goal of being able to not have more of the protected land become farmland? Where do you think we are?
I think we're making tremendous progress, but there's still a long ways to go. The Nature Conservancy is partnering with Michigan State and NRCS to develop some tools that will measure, just those things, those conservation outcomes at the growing region scale, and link that back to the farm scale. But, that's a work in progress, so we can't fully tell that story. But just looking at some of those big conservation outcomes that I mentioned, even though we've had continuous improvement, those big conservation outcomes are still getting worse, not better. So we still have a ways to go.
So you're characterizing this as progress in the right direction, but in fact, the underlying problem is worsening.
That's right. So the progress isn't quick enough.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so we need to accelerate it so that we can overtake the degradation. We can end up actually moving the ball forward. So we're moving the ball, ball's rolling back at a slower rate. Or staying in about the same place.
Yeah, and there's one other sort of point of tension here, and that is that for those practices that improve yields and profitability and also conservation, producers they'll want to adopt those. There's a whole suite of other practices that take land out of production, but might be very good for water quality.
Right.
And so we don't have enough funding through the Farm Bill conservation programs. We don't have enough incentives through supply chain dynamics to compensate producers for ecosystem services like that. And until we're really using the full suite of both in-field practices, edge-of-field practices, downstream and in-stream practices, we're not going to move the needle on water quality at the watershed scale. So, I think a lot of people who don't know enough about agriculture think, it's the farmer's fault, and the bullseye is on the farmer. Well, we would actually like to take the bullseye off the farmer and say this is more of society's challenge. And, the farmers can do their part for the infield practices, but the rest of us have to help in terms of incentivizing those other practices that we know will be good for water quality, water availability, biodiversity, reducing greenhouse gas emissions, et cetera.
When you say the rest of us more, what does he mean?
Oh, well, I think in the long run, what he means is that we can't expect farmers to take land out of production and turn them back into wetlands, which is perhaps the most efficient way to reduce the water quality benefits or to reduce the water quality impacts, unless we're willing to really compensate them, and that's a societal piece.
Where are we? I'm going to ask you the same question that I asked because that elicited such a remarkable answer. Where are we in the continuum of sustainability with respect to what you work in? Like, where do you think we?
How do I think about it?
Yeah.
So I agree with Sean. I mean, we've been concerned about water quality in the Mississippi River really, for a long time, but we've been tracking it really closely since like 1990. And we have yet to see any real improvement.
Huh, interesting.
Yeah.
And yet you feel that there's quality work being done.
There's work being done.
pretty quick, so-
What I'm excited about is that I think that
Takeaways from today.
in the last, did someone want to contribute?
Yeah.
I think somebody's got a mic on or something.
Oh, okay. So what I'm excited about is things like Field to Market and the Soil Health Partnership we're talking about. We've been doing this work in the same way, in a sort of farmer by farmer basis since 1990, and looking at things like Field to Market and using the supply chain more effectively to leverage these kind of changes in practices, I think allows us to think about getting to a bigger
Scale it
scale
up, yeah.
that we've never really had the reach or impact for. So I think that's really that's change.
So you're optimistic.
Yeah.
Mike number one.
I've been sort of struggling with how to frame a question and who to address it to, because I think that part of why we're all here is that it's a really tangled web, this food system and sustainability and all these issues that we're trying to address. And I feel like even in the last panel, there was a lot of talking past each other. And, I've had a very unique life experience, and I've got to see a lot of different aspects of the food system and work on a lot of different aspects, from the farm to litigation to regulation. And I understand biotechnology and in an international way at home and abroad and the issues that we're facing. But I also see a lot of the questions like that you just brought up with, people's concern are not just with health, and it's not just a lack of understanding, I think, of technology, which there obviously is, and how that gets communicated is very important. But also, I think there's a lot of questions as to the crops that have been modified, and like corn production and soy production and sugar beet production, which is what is going into a lot of our processed foods. And a lot of these processed foods, while they're feeding people at home, are also producing a very nutrient-poor diet for the children that are consuming them. So I think that's a lot of maybe some bloggers' issues as well, is there. And then you have a lot of corn that's going to feed a lot of meat that's producing a lot of emissions, and that's a problem. However, we also need to feed the world. And there's also a lot of miscommunication about, biotech products' ability to reduce pesticide use. And I feel like all these issues are so interwoven and tangled, and we are all kind of working in our own little pockets to try and solve the problem. And like you said, you're on the producer side, but there's also, there's the supply chain. This chain is all connected. Mm-hmm. And I guess my question is, how do we connect these dots in a sustainable way, not just for the environment, but to sustain this conversation in a really positive and inclusive way that bridges all these gaps, that graphs them, or
I think you have articulated that very well. So thank you for that. I think you've captured a lot of the essence of the discussion here. And frankly, I have to tell you, I think that's a great takeaway from this conference. The idea that it's tangled, it's complicated, and the organizers of this conference have the guts to have that conversation and to allow it to happen and let it hurt a little bit. Let it understand that this is complicated. Lots of things are complicated. This is our food. This is the world's food. It should be complicated. And there are lots of people with very, very different interests, but they're not necessarily competing interests. They're just different places in the spectrum. I think people who think it should be a certain way probably want a really good outcome. They probably want a lot of food to be produced and a lot of people to eat it, and people who want it a different way also want a really good outcome. And I think that's an important takeaway. I think you've captured the essence of the discussion. Rod, I'm going to throw it to you because, again, you are an example of a system that is moving toward greater output and greater efficiency and possibly greater profitability, and yet is navigating around this tangled web. But you have articulated that it's tangled.
Absolutely. I mean, it's a great question. It's a very tough question. I would say right now, farmers essentially are responding to market demands. So if people want steak, they're going to give them steak. I mean, that's kind of where we are right now, right? So, so there's certain questions that you pose to the farmer. There's other questions you pose, at other points along the supply chain, and there's other questions we just pose to ourselves. What do we want our diets to be, et cetera. I think from Field to Market's perspective, we want to make sure that whatever farmers are producing, that they're doing it in the most environmentally sensitive, sustainable way possible. And some of these larger questions absolutely need to be asked, need to be addressed. Unfortunately, from my little corner of the world, we're just doing what we can to get that ag production as best as we can.
Sean?
So excellent question. I think whether or not you're talking about organic fruits or vegetables or specialty crops or, GMO, corn or soybeans, I think as long as you're focused on outcomes, every crop and every sector has room for continuous improvement. So, how can you work with producers, use the field to market methodology to benchmark where they are? As they adopt additional practices, you can document their continuous improvement over time. The nutrition question is a very interesting one, and the Nature Conservancy doesn't have expertise on that, but perhaps the nutritional content of foods, should be one of those outcomes that would be measured, and we would leave that to other organizations to do that. One thing I've heard, and I will preface this with, I have not read any scientific literature about this, but I am told by some scientists that this is an emerging field, is that soil health, the healthier the soil, the healthier the food. I can't cite a paper that backs that up, but there are scientists who have told me that. One way to make soil healthier is by feeding the microbial community in the soil. An interesting statistic from NRCS recently is that 1 acre of healthy soil has enough biomass living in it, the microbial communities, that mass would equate to 2 full-grown African elephants. And how can you feed that diversity unless you have a diversity of cover, like cover crops? You're not going to feed that kind of diversity with a monoculture. So one could surmise, if that preface is true, that healthier soil equals healthier food, that we need to have cover crops. We need to have forms of conservation tillage that can nourish that life under the soil that would in turn make for healthier food.
Maura, you have a view on? This is not, yours was less of a question than a sort of a broad question.
Right, I agree. I agree with you that this is a really complex system, and that in some ways the best we can do is acknowledge that this is truly complex, and that we are all imperfect in our working towards it. And sometimes I feel like, especially in a room like this, is that we're all very comfortable. Sort of building on what you're saying, is we're all very comfortable acknowledging that we're all eaters, and my job is to say, why don't we acknowledge we're all drinkers too? That we have to start thinking about this same complex system around the water quality and the water quantity and the healthy rivers, all that piece as well.
Yeah, and I think, again, I think you articulated that very well. There's a lot to take in today. But I will say to you, I'm not sure that we're talking past each other. I think this is how the conversation has to happen. It has to be heard. People have to feel heard on all sides of this issue. If there are many people in this room who are frustrated by whether it's the media's perception or interest group perception or consumer perception, we should hear that. And I think the last panel, we certainly took away the fact that there's a lot of frustration there, and we need to figure that out. And on the other side, things have to be heard. And it's that tweet that we had in the first panel where somebody asked about how much weight do you give different views. I think that's a very important question. We think about this a lot in the media, that we can't give everything equal weight, because then we give credibility to things that we don't. But at the same time, then it becomes a judgment on my part or on our part as to why did I decide that's valid and that's not valid. I'll give you an example completely outside of the realm of food. But we struggled at CNN when that, I told a few people this, when that pastor in Florida was going to burn that Quran. And that guy, before the media got involved, had 300 followers and no social media, and would have burned that thing and nobody would have known about it in the entire world. But by the end of it, we had the president involved, and we had the Taliban involved, and we were covering this this guy 24/7. I don't know if that's right or wrong. I don't know. We created a guy who controlled our news cycle for a very long time and risked people's lives. There were American soldiers on the other side of the world who were in danger, and there were all sorts of things that happened out of that. Did we give him too much credibility? Should we just have said, we're not covering this? Because that would have been a judgment call. That would have been us saying, we don't believe that political ideology and we don't believe there's any science behind it. There certainly isn't science behind what he was doing. And that's interesting. So that becomes tough for us to figure out what to do. But we will hear it. We will listen to it, and we will continue to go forward. But I actually think, from my perspective, this has been a very, very fruitful discussion, and I appreciate the time that you've taken and that everybody else has taken to articulate your views and your concerns. Thank you for this very informative panel, and congratulations to all of you for the work that you're doing. And I think the takeaway, by the way, is that sounds very successful. You've picked the right projects, things are going on, but you all articulated that for all the work that's been done, the progress hasn't been made, which means if all of this work weren't being done, we'd be seeing greater setbacks. So I think that's a really good takeaway. So I'll thank you for that, and I'll please invite you to thank our panel. All right. JR, are we going into to you and me? Yeah. Let's come on up here. Let's talk for a minute. We'll let you put that mic on, and then we'll figure it out. I'm going to ask Jay for he opened it up for us, and he's been guiding us through it, so I want to ask him for his thoughts and his takeaways on this.
Can you hear me?
We can.
Now? This is hard work, so anybody feel tired? So we clearly were reminded today that farming is hard work, even with modern mechanization and the ability to control weeds without having to pull them by hand, using herbicides, et cetera, but it's also hard work talking about these very complicated issues and sharing views that don't always align. So I think we've, for CropLife, certainly checked that box today. We've met some new people. As I said earlier, we've gotten reacquainted with some friends that maybe we haven't seen in a while, but we've mixed it up in a way that,
Try that, apparently.
Wouldn't have happened had we not been here today. The one thing that, we're looking for a headline to me that I think you really ended up the last panel around is continuous improvement. And we've done a lot of that. There's more to be done. And if we hadn't accomplished the continuous improvement that is as of right now today, we'd be in a lot worse shape in terms of being able to feed fewer people and having a more severe environmental footprint than we've got today from farming and the rest of the food system. But that's not good enough because there are more of us being born and more of us that have greater incomes and want a better diet. And so the demands that are there are very real, and we're all challenged to find out ways to contribute to that next round of solutions.
I'll say a couple of things, Jay. One is I do invite those of you who can watch Al Jazeera America to watch what we do. You'll find a disproportionate amount of coverage on agriculture and food, and I think you'll find it good. I think you'll find that we get into these issues. We really go deep into them. The second thing I'll say is that we're all busy. You're busy people. You work in a particularly busy industry. And so if you come to a conference where everybody agrees on anything, it's a colossal waste of time. You have to be able to engage in complicated and difficult discussions. Otherwise, this is just a conference to get together with people, which is actually a particularly good idea anyway. But I think the organizers have done a great job of setting up discussions that don't have natural alignment sometimes. because we know what we believe in, we know what we like, we know what our goals are, but we need to know what other people's goals are and how best to achieve that sort of thing. So I actually think that there's some real thinking that's gone into this, and some of your questions and the way they were developed and the care that was taken to sort of articulate these views was very useful.
Yeah, precisely. And so I think it's important to also, in closing, reassure all of you, no matter where you come from in this continuum of interest in our food and farming sectors, that our industry members are committed to continuous improvement and scientific excellence and doing the right thing. Does that mean that they'll be able to do the right thing each and every day with each and every action? No, we're human, but I like to say that we've benefited from this kind of dialogue, even though we haven't embraced it as much as we have in these last 5 years. We took special occasion to recognize the 50-year anniversary of Silent Spring in 2012. And acknowledge that environmental movement that Rachel Carson started with Silent Spring in 1962 wasn't comfortable for us then, but all of that has helped drive us in a direction that has incentivized us and brought society into the picture in a way that has caused us to drive this continuous improvement. And it's not going to stop today or tomorrow, and we want to be part of that future solution.
And with that, we will wrap it up, and thank you for your time. I suspect, given how involved everybody is, that there'll be a lot of conversations going on the way out, and I think that's the best part of it. So thank you so much for your participation and for your great questions and for sharing it all with us. Thank you.